Welcome to the Grateful Living Podcast.
Hi, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the Grateful Living Podcast. Whether you're listening whilst you're driving, walking the dog, cleaning the house, or having a cup of tea, or maybe you're just taking some time for yourself today, thank you for pressing play. Today's episode is one I've wanted to record for a long time. We're going to be talking about chakras, but maybe not in the way you've heard people talk about them before. Because when people hear the word chakras, they often fall into one of two camps. The first camp is people who absolutely love the topic. They've heard about chakras before, maybe they've been to a yoga class, maybe they've had some energy healing, or they've heard people talking about blocked chakras and balancing them and healing them. And then there are people on the opposite end of the spectrum who hear the word chakras and immediately think, what on earth is that? Or that sounds a little bit too woo-woo for me. And honestly, I do understand both perspectives because I think sometimes in the wellness industry, we can do a really poor job of explaining these concepts. We throw around words like energy, vibration, frequency, intuition, and alignment, and we assume everyone knows what we're talking about. If you're new to this world, it can feel a little bit confusing. And if you're naturally more skeptical, it can feel frustrating. So what I want to do today is bridge the gap. I want to explore the chakra system from three different perspectives. Firstly, its ancient origins. Secondly, what modern psychology and science can tell us about the mind-body connection. And thirdly, how I personally see these themes show up through my work as a holistic therapist. Because whether you believe in chakras or not, there is something incredibly powerful about understanding the connection between your mind, your emotions, your energetic field, and your body. And that is really what today's conversation is about. It's not about convincing you of anything. It's not about telling you what to believe. It's about offering a framework, a lens through which you can understand yourself more deeply. Before we dive into the history, I want to share a little bit about why this topic means so much to me. Because if you've followed my journey for a while, you'll know that I didn't start out in the holistic world. I studied sociology. I completed a master's degree in human rights and global ethics. I worked within charities, community organisations, and sales. But my background has always been rooted in understanding people, understanding systems, behaviours, suffering, and healing. But over the years, what became increasingly clear to me was that so much of our healing doesn't happen solely through thinking. It doesn't happen solely through understanding. And it certainly doesn't happen solely through talking, because we can understand why we feel anxious. We can understand why we struggle with relationships and where our fears come from and still feel stuck. And that was fascinating to me, because what I began to realize is that healing isn't just happening in the mind, it was happening in the body too. Through massage, touch, breath, emotional release, nervous system regulation, through learning how to feel safe again. And that's what eventually led me to holistic therapies. And it's also what led me to becoming interested in ancient healing systems like the chakra system. Not because I wanted to replace science, but because I became curious. I wanted to understand why so many ancient cultures seemed to recognize connections between emotions and different parts of the body long before modern psychology existed. So let's go back, way back, like thousands of years, to ancient India. The word chakra comes from Sanskrit. Sanskrit is one of the oldest known languages in the world, and the word chakra literally translates as wheel or disc. The idea was that these centers of energy were constantly moving, spinning, and flowing throughout the body. Now, here's something really interesting. Most people assume the 7 chakra system has always existed exactly as we know it today, but that's actually not true. The chakra system evolved over time, and understanding that makes it more fascinating. The earliest references that scholars believe relate to chakras can be traced back to ancient Indian spiritual texts known as the Upanishads. These texts were written somewhere between approximately 800 BCE and 200 BCE. That's over 2,000 years ago. And these writings explored questions that human beings are still asking today. Who am I? Why do I suffer? What is consciousness? What is the nature of reality? What happens when we die? How do we live a meaningful life? These weren't casual questions, they were profound physiological explorations. Ancient yogis spent years observing the mind, the body, breath, consciousness, meditation, human behavior, and they began developing maps to explain their observations. One of those maps eventually became what we now call the chakra system. It's important to understand that the chakra system wasn't originally created as a wellness trend. It wasn't created for Instagram or to sell crystals. It emerged from a deep spiritual tradition seeking to understand human consciousness. The people developing these ideas were asking enormous questions about existence itself, and that context matters because sometimes we reduce chakras down to simple self-help concepts, but their origins are much deeper than that. One concept that appears repeatedly in ancient yogic philosophy is the idea of subtle body. Now that can sound strange if you've never heard it before, but stay with me. Ancient traditions recognized that human beings seem to operate on multiple levels. There was the physical body, the body of flesh and bone, but there was also the emotional experience of being alive, the mental, spiritual, energetic experience. And they use the term subtle body to describe these less tangible aspects of human existence. Today we might use different language. We might talk about thoughts, emotions, psychological states, stress responses, trauma, the nervous system, mood, identity, meaning, purpose. But ancient cultures were observing many of the same phenomena. They simply used a different framework to describe them. And one thing I find fascinating is this. Ancient healers didn't have MRI scanners, they didn't have neuroscience or psychology textbooks, and yet many of their observations about how emotions affect the body are remarkably similar to what modern science tells us now. Not identical, but similar enough to make us curious. And curiosity is where wisdom begins. So now you're probably wondering, okay, Tanisha, this is all really interesting history, but what does it have to do with my life? Everything. Because despite our technological advances, human beings haven't changed that much. We still experience fear, we still experience grief, we still experience shame, we still experience love and loss and anxiety, and we're still searching for meaning, and we want to feel safe and connected, and we want to belong. And many of these themes represented by the chakra system revolve around exactly these experiences. The names might be ancient, but the struggles are timeless. And perhaps that's why these teachings have survived for thousands of years, because they continue to speak to something deeply human. So in the next part of this episode, we're going to explore something really fascinating. We're going to talk about what ancient cultures meant when they spoke about energy. We're going to look at similar concepts between different cultures around the world, and then we're going to bridge that into modern science and the nervous system. Because once we understand that connection, the chakra system starts to make a whole lot more sense. So grab a cup of tea, take a breath, and let's continue. A quick pause before we continue. One thing I've learned about my own healing journey is that transformation isn't always about the big breakthroughs. Sometimes it's the small daily rituals that help us feel safe, grounded, and connected to ourselves. That's why I created the Grateful Living Apothecary, a collection of sprays and ritual tools designed to support calm, grounding, and alignment in everyday life. If you're looking to create more moments of peace in your day, you'll find the collection linked in the show notes. Now let's continue. So, before the break, we explored where the chakra system came from. We travelled back thousands of years to ancient India. We talked about the yogis, philosophers, and spiritual seekers who were trying to understand some of life's biggest questions. Questions around suffering, meaning, consciousness, connection, and what it means to be human. Now I want to explore something that often creates confusion for people. The idea of energy. Because let's be honest, the word energy gets used a lot, and depending on who's saying it, it can mean very different things. You hear people say, that person has bad energy, this room feels heavy, my energy feels drained, I need to protect my energy. And sometimes people hear those phrases and think, what does that actually mean? What's fascinating is that ancient India wasn't the only culture talking about energy. In fact, all around the world, different civilizations developed remarkable similar concepts. Ancient Chinese medicine spoke about qi. In Japan, there is the concept of ki. Ancient Greek philosophers spoke about the vital force of life. Traditional Polynesian cultures spoke about mana. Different words, different cultures, different geographical locations, yet many were describing a similar idea, that human beings seemed to possess some form of life force that influenced health, well-being, vitality, and emotional balance. Now, were they talking about energy in the scientific sense that we use today? No, not exactly. They weren't describing electricity. They weren't measuring electromagnetic fields. They weren't discussing physics. They were attempting to describe the experience of being alive. And I think that's a very important distinction, because when ancient people used the word energy, they were often talking about something experiential, something felt, something observed, not necessarily something measured. Think about this. Imagine trying to explain anxiety to someone who had never experienced it before. You might say, my chest feels tight, my stomach is in knots, my thoughts won't stop racing, my body feels on edge. Those sensations are real, even if they can't be seen, even if they can't be held in your hand, even if they're difficult to measure directly. And that's where I think many ancient traditions were coming from. They were observing patterns between emotions, behavior, physical sensations, patterns between well-being and illness. One thing I find really interesting is that long before psychology existed as a formal discipline, people already recognized that emotions lived in the body. Think about the language we still use today. We say, my heart is broken. I have a gut feeling. That made my blood boil. I feel weighed down. I've got a lump in my throat. I can't stomach it. Isn't that interesting? Even our everyday language reflects the relationship between emotions and the body, because instinctively, we know they're connected. When we're nervous before an interview, where do we feel it? Usually our stomach. When we're grieving, often in our chest. When we're afraid, our whole body can tense. When we're ashamed, we might want to shrink ourselves. When we're angry, heat rises. The jaw tightens. The fists clench. The body is never separated from our emotional experience. And that understanding sits at the heart of both ancient healing traditions and modern neuroscience. Now let's fast forward a few thousand years, because while science doesn't validate chakras as physical structures in the body, it has revealed something equally fascinating. The mind and the body are deeply interconnected, far more interconnected than we once believed. For a long time, Western medicine viewed the body almost like a machine. If something broke, you fixed that part. Problem solved. But over the last few decades, we've learned that things are far more complex, because your emotional state affects your physical health, and your physical state affects your emotional health. They are constantly communicating every second of every day, which brings us to the nervous system. And honestly, if there is one thing I wish every person understood, it's this. Because once you understand your nervous system, so many things suddenly start making sense. Your nervous system has one primary responsibility. Keeping you alive. That's it. Not making you happy or successful or helping you manifest or helping you achieve your goals. Its first priority is survival. Always. Your nervous system is constantly scanning your environment, looking for signs of safety or danger, asking questions like, am I safe, supported, connected? Do I need to protect myself? Do I need to fight? Do I need to run or shut down? And the fascinating thing is that much of this happens automatically, without conscious thought. Most people have heard of fight or flight, but there are actually several common survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, and what many therapists now refer to as fawn. Fight might look like anger, control, defensiveness, irritability. Flight can look like busyness, overworking, overthinking, never really slowing down. Freeze can look like numbness, exhaustion, disconnection, feeling stuck. And fawn can look like people-pleasing, overgiving, struggling with boundaries, constantly trying to keep everyone else happy. Now, I want you to notice something. These aren't character flaws, they're adaptations. They're your nervous system trying to protect you. And this is where things get really interesting, because many of these survival patterns overlap with the themes represented in different chakras. Not because chakras and neuroscience are the same thing, but because both systems are observing human behavior from different angles. Have you ever noticed that stress doesn't exist just purely in your mind? It lives somewhere. Maybe your shoulders, your jaw, your neck, lower back, your stomach. That's because emotions are not purely mental experiences. They're physiological experiences too. When you're stressed, your body releases hormones, your breathing changes, your muscles tighten, heart rate changes, digestion and posture changes, everything changes. And if stress becomes chronic, the body can begin holding those patterns for long periods of time, sometimes even years. Now, I want to be careful here because you'll often hear people say things like trauma is stored in the hips or all grief is stored in the lungs. The reality is more nuanced than that. The science isn't that simple. But what we do know is that experiences can create long-lasting physiological patterns, and many people experience recurring areas of tension linked to emotional stress. In my massage practice, I've seen this countless of times. People arrive convinced they're only carrying physical tension. Then as the body begins relaxing, emotions emerge, sometimes tears, memories, profound exhaustion, sometimes relief. Not because massage magically releases trauma, but because when the body feels safe enough to let go, things that were being held can come into awareness, and that's incredibly powerful. One of the most important lessons I've learned through both my personal healing journey and my professional work is this: the body remembers experiences differently from the mind. Your mind might tell you, I'm over it, happened years ago, it wasn't a big deal, I should be fine by now. And yet your body still responds as though the threat is present. The chest tightens, the stomach drops, the shoulders rise, the breath becomes shallow, the nervous system activates. Not because you're broken or weak or because you've been doing healing wrong, but because healing isn't purely intellectual, it's embodied. And this brings us beautifully back to our conversation about chakras. Because whether you view chakras as spiritual energy centers or psychological archetypes or symbolic maps of human experience, the invitation is the same. Pay attention, notice, become curious. The chakra system encourages us to ask questions such as, do I feel safe? Can I express myself? Can I trust myself? Can I love? Can I allow myself to feel? Do I feel connected to something bigger than myself? And honestly, those are incredible, valuable questions, whether you believe in chakras or not, because they invite self-awareness, and self-awareness is where healing begins. So before we move on to exploring each of the 7 chakras individually, I want to leave you with a few questions. Not questions to answer immediately, just to sit with. When do you feel most safe? When do you feel most connected? When do you feel most alive? When do you feel most shut down? Where do you hold stress in your body? What emotions are easiest for you to feel? What emotions feel difficult? And what might your body be trying to tell you? Take a deep breath. Notice what comes up. No judgment, no fixing, just awareness, because awareness is often the first step towards transformation. As we're talking about chakras today, I wanted to briefly share a resource from the Grateful Living Apothecary. Many of us understand healing intellectually, but our bodies also need ritual, intention, and sensory experiences to help us embody that healing. The Grateful Living Apothecary offers sprays and ritual tools designed to support calm, grounding, and energetic alignment, helping you create sacred moments of connection throughout your day. You can find the collection in the show notes. Now, let's return to today's conversation. So, welcome back. Now that we've explored the history of the chakra system and we've looked at some of the fascinating connections between ancient wisdom and modern understandings of the mind-body connection, it's time to dive into the heart of today's episode, the 7 chakras themselves. But before we start, I want to make something really clear. One of the biggest misunderstandings I see when people first learn about chakras is they think that I need to open all my chakras. This chakra is blocked, or this chakra is broken. And honestly, that's not how I view this work, because we're not machines, we're human beings. We're constantly changing. We're constantly responding to life. We're moving through different seasons, challenges, relationships, experiences. And because of that, different themes may become more prominent at different times in our lives. Think of the chakra system less like a checklist and more like a map of human development, human experience. A map that asks, what does it mean to be a human being? What do I need in order to thrive? What challenges do we encounter along the way? And what lessons are we here to learn? One of the reasons I love the chakra system is because it follows a beautiful progression. It starts with survival and ends with meaning. It starts with our most basic human needs and gradually moves towards our highest questions about purpose, connection, and consciousness. And if you really think about it, that makes sense. Because before we can focus on purpose, we need safety. Before we can fully open our hearts, we need some sense of self. Before we can speak our truth, we need to know who we are. So let's start at the beginning, the root. The root chakra. The root chakra sits at the base of the spine. In Sanskrit, it's known as Muladhara. 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 Muladhara roughly translate to root support. And honestly, I think it's such a beautiful name because that's exactly what this chakra represents. Support, foundation, stability, safety, belonging. If you think about a tree, the roots are everything. You can have the most beautiful branches, the most beautiful leaves or fruit, but without roots, none of it survives. And in many ways, the same is true for us. The chakra is associated with our most basic needs: food, shelter, safety, security, community, connection, belonging. Historically, our ancestors lived in environments where survival was far less certain than it is today. There were predators, famine, conflict, disease, harsh weather. Being separated from the tribe could literally mean death. So our nervous systems evolved to prioritize safety above everything else. And whilst most of us aren't running from predators anymore, our nervous systems haven't caught up as quickly as our modern world. Today, threats might look like, financial stress, job insecurity, relationship instability, burnout, feeling unsupported, alone, disconnected, feeling like the ground beneath your feet isn't stable. When root chakra themes become activated, we often hear thoughts like, what if everything falls apart? What if I can't cope? What if I lose what I have? What if I'm not supported? What if I'm alone? I think that this is one of the reasons why anxiety has become so common, because many of us are living in a state of chronic uncertainty, and uncertainty often activates our survival systems. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When people talk about healing the root chakra, they often focus on affirmations. And whilst affirmations can be helpful, the root chakra isn't healed through words alone. It's healed through experiences of safety. Safety in your body, your relationships, your environment, and safety in your nervous system. Because your body doesn't care what you say, your body responds to what it experiences. And I think that's an important distinction, because sometimes we tell ourselves, I'm safe, I'm safe, I'm safe, while simultaneously overworking, overstimulating ourselves, ignoring our needs, and never resting. And the body says, no, we're not. True safety is something we experience, not something we force ourselves to believe. So, some questions for reflection for you. Where in your life do you currently feel unsupported? And where in your life do you feel deeply supported? Moving upwards, we arrive at the sacral chakra, known in Sanskrit as Svadhisthana. Svadhisthana chakra. Located around the lower abdomen and pelvis, this chakra represents emotion, creativity, pleasure, connection, sensuality, flow, life force energy. Now, this is where things start getting really interesting, because if the root chakra asks, am I safe? The sacral chakra asks, can I feel? And for many people, that's a surprisingly difficult question, because so many of us were taught to suppress emotions, not intentionally, but through conditioning. Perhaps you were told to stop crying, don't be dramatic, you're too sensitive, get on with it. Maybe you learned that expressing anger wasn't acceptable. Maybe you learned that sadness was weakness, or that joy was something to feel guilty about. Over time, we can become disconnected from our emotional world, not because we don't have emotions, but because we stop allowing ourselves to feel them. What's fascinating is that creativity and emotion live within the same chakra. And I don't think that's accidental, because creativity requires feeling. It requires expression, movement. And when we suppress our emotions, we often suppress our creativity too. And this doesn't just apply to art. Creativity isn't just painting or writing. It's also how you solve problems, how you express yourself, how you engage with life, how you allow yourself to experience joy. One of the questions I often ask clients is, when was the last time you did something purely because it brought you joy? Not because it was productive or because it made you money or because it helped someone else, but just because it felt good. And honestly, many people struggle to answer, because we've become so disconnected from pleasure, so disconnected from play, from simply being. The sacral chakra reminds us that we're not here purely to survive. We are also here to experience life. What emotions do you find easiest to feel, and which emotions do you tend to avoid? Now we move into the solar plexus, located around the upper abdomen, known as the Manipura chakra, traditionally associated with fire. And honestly, when you understand this chakra, that symbol makes perfect sense, because fire transforms. Fire creates energy, movement, and action. The solar plexus is the center of identity, self-worth, confidence, personal power, decision-making, boundaries, autonomy. If the root asks, am I safe? And the sacral asks, can I feel? The solar plexus asks, who am I? And I think this is one of the most important questions we ever ask ourselves, because so much suffering comes from trying to become who we think we should be, rather than discovering who we truly are. Many of us spend years seeking approval, trying to fit in, trying to be liked, trying to avoid criticism, trying to meet expectations. And somewhere along the way, we can lose connection with ourselves. A healthy solar plexus isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's not arrogance, it's not ego, it's not domination. It's self-trust. It's being able to say, this is who I am, this is what I need, this is what I believe, without needing everyone else to agree. And that is incredibly powerful. So, just to recap, so far in this episode, we've explored the roots of the chakra system in ancient India. We've looked at the idea of energy through both ancient philosophy and modern understandings of the mind-body connection. And we've journeyed through the first 3 chakras, the root, the sacral, the solar plexus. Safety, emotion, identity. And what's fascinating is that those first 3 chakras are very much connected to our personal world, our survival, our feelings, our sense of self. But now we arrive at what many traditions consider the bridge, the meeting point, the place where our relationship with ourselves begins to become our relationship with others, the heart. The heart chakra is also known as Anahata, Anahata, Anahata chakra. The Anahata chakra, the heart chakra, sits in the center of the chest, and traditionally it is associated with the element of air, breath, expansion, movement, connection. Now, if you spent any time in spiritual spaces, you've probably heard people say, open your heart, or lead with love. And whilst those ideas sound beautiful, I think they can sometimes oversimplify something that is actually incredibly complex. Because the heart chakra isn't just about love, it's also about grief, loss, forgiveness, trust, vulnerability, and those things aren't always easy. One of the things I've noticed both through my personal healing journey and my work with women is that many of us are walking around with hearts that are simultaneously longing for connection and protecting themselves from it. We want intimacy, we want closeness, we want to be understood, but we've also been hurt, disappointed, rejected, abandoned, betrayed, misunderstood. And when those experiences happen, the body adapts. The nervous system adapts. We build walls, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. What's interesting from a psychological perspective is that human beings are wired for connection. Research consistently shows that healthy relationships contribute to well-being, resilience, and even physical health. Connection isn't a luxury, it's a need. Yet many of us have learned to equate vulnerability with danger. And that's where heart chakra themes often emerge. Not because something is wrong with us, but because we're trying to protect ourselves. I think one of the most misunderstood aspects of healing is that an open heart does not mean having boundaries. In fact, I would argue the opposite. A healthy heart chakra includes boundaries, because boundaries are what allow love to exist without resentment. For years, many people, especially women, have been taught that being loving means always giving, always saying yes, always being available, always putting others first, but eventually that leads to exhaustion, not connection. A healthy heart understands that you can be compassionate without abandoning yourself. You can be kind without sacrificing your well-being. You can love deeply while still honoring your own needs. And perhaps one of the greatest lessons of the heart chakra is this: love is not the absence of boundaries. Love is the presence of truth. Now let's talk about grief, because I don't think we can have an honest conversation about the heart chakra without talking about loss. And if you've listened to my podcast before, you'll know that grief has been a huge part of my own story. Losing my mum at 14 changed me, shaped me. It broke me open in ways I didn't understand at the time. And like many people who experience significant loss, I've spent years trying to make sense of it, trying to understand it, to move through it. What I've come to learn is that grief isn't something we get over. It's something we learn to carry. And the heart chakra reminds us that grief exists because love existed first. You cannot grieve what you never cared about. So if you're carrying grief right now, I want you to hear this. Your grief is not evidence that you're broken. It's evidence that you loved. And that's a very different story. So some questions for reflection. Where in your life are you protecting your heart? Where in your life are you allowing yourself to be seen? Moving upwards, we arrive at the throat chakra. Vishuddhi chakra. Vishuddhi. Shuddhi, Vishuddhi chakra. Located in the throat and neck, associated with communication, truth, expression, authenticity. And honestly, this is one of my favorite chakras to work with because it shows up everywhere. Shows up in relationships, families, friendships, business, dating, boundaries, conflict, everywhere. Because ultimately, this chakra asks a very simple question. Is it safe for me to tell the truth? And when I say truth, I don't just mean facts. I mean your truth, your feelings, your needs, your opinions, your desires, your boundaries, your voice. Think about how many people spend years saying, I'm fine, when really they're not. Saying yes when they mean no, pretending something doesn't bother them when it does, holding back thoughts, swallowing emotions, avoiding difficult conversations. Most of us weren't taught healthy communication, we were taught survival. We learned what felt safe in our environment. Maybe speaking up led to conflict, maybe expressing emotion wasn't welcomed, maybe your needs weren't consistently met, so you adapted. What fascinates me is that communication isn't just about speaking, it's also about listening. Listening to yourself, your body, what you're feeling beneath the surface, because often the hardest truth to hear is our own. A healthy throat chakra isn't about saying everything that comes into your head. It's about honest, compassionate expression. It's about speaking from a regulated place rather than a reactive one. It's being able to say, this hurt me. I need support. I disagree. I've changed my mind. This isn't working for me. Without guilt, without shame, without apologizing for your existence. So some reflection questions for you is, what truth have you been avoiding? Not because you're weak, but because you're human. Now we move into the third eye chakra. Ajna chakra. Ajna chakra. Located between the eyebrows, associated with intuition, insight, perception, wisdom, awareness, this chakra is perhaps one of the most misunderstood. Because when people hear intuition, they often imagine something mystical. Some magical gift that only certain people can possess. But that's not how I see intuition at all. To me, intuition is your ability to perceive, your ability to notice, to recognize patterns, to hear the quieter voice beneath the noise. And here's the thing. We all have intuition, every single one of us. The challenge isn't whether intuition exists. The challenge is whether we're listening. Modern life is noisy. Constant notifications, information, opinions, comparison, stimulation. And when we're constantly consuming, it becomes very difficult to hear ourselves. I think many people mistake intuition for certainty. But intuition often doesn't arrive as certainty. It arrives as a whisper, a feeling, a knowing, a sense that something isn't quite right, or perhaps a sense that something is deeply right, even when you can't fully explain why. From a psychological perspective, some researchers suggest intuition may partly involve unconscious pattern recognition, the brain noticing things before conscious awareness catches up. And I think that's fascinating because whether you view intuition spiritually or psychologically, the invitation is similar. Pay attention. The third eye encourages us to become observers, to step back, notice, reflect, question. Not everything we think is true. Not every fear is reality. Not every story our mind tells us is fact. Wisdom often begins when we learn to observe our thoughts rather than immediately believe them. So, a question for reflection would be, what would change if you trusted yourself a little more? And finally, we arrive at the crown chakra. Sahasrara chakra. Sahasrara chakra. Located at the top of the head, representing spirituality, meaning, purpose, connection, transcendence. Now, depending on your beliefs, this chakra may resonate differently. Some people connect it to God, or the universe, or nature, or collective consciousness. Some simply to a sense of meaning and purpose. What's important is that throughout human history, people have consistently asked questions that go beyond survival. Questions like, why am I here? What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? How do I live well? The crown chakra reflects that search, that curiosity, that longing to understand something bigger than ourselves. And interestingly, modern psychology also recognizes the importance of meaning. Researchers have found that people who experience a sense of purpose often demonstrate greater resilience during difficult times, not because life becomes easier, but because suffering feels more navigatable when connected to meaning. For me personally, spirituality has never been about having all the answers. It's about remaining open to the mystery, remaining curious, remaining humble, because the older I get, the less interested I become in certainty, and the more interested I become in wonder. The crown chakra reminds us that we are part of something larger than our individual worries, that our lives matter, that connection matters, that meaning matters, and perhaps that is one of the most beautiful invitations of all. So, some reflection questions. What gives your life meaning? Not what looks impressive, not what other people value, what genuinely matters to you. So now we've traveled through all 7 chakras, from survival to meaning, from grounding to transcendence, from physical realities of life to deeper questions of existence. And what I hope you're beginning to see is that the chakra system is far more than a spiritual concept. It's a map of human experience, a map of questions we all wrestle with. Am I safe? Can I feel? Who am I? Can I love? Can I speak my truth? Can I trust myself? Can I trust life? So if you've made it this far, firstly, thank you, because I know this episode has been a deep one. We've traveled through thousands of years of history. We've explored ancient India, yogic philosophy, the subtle body, the nervous system, psychology, trauma, emotions, relationships, intuition, meaning, and everything in between. And if you're anything like me, you might be sitting there thinking, wow, that's a lot. And it is, because ultimately we're talking about what it means to be human. But now I want to bring everything together, because perhaps the biggest question people have when learning about chakras is, okay, but why do they become imbalanced in the first place? Why do some people struggle with safety or intimacy or confidence or boundaries or trust? And whilst the answer is complex, I think it begins with a simple truth. None of us arrive in adulthood untouched by life. Every single one of us has experiences that shape us, experiences that teach us what is safe, what isn't safe, who we need to be to receive love, how we should behave, what emotions are acceptable, what emotions are dangerous. Long before we consciously understood ourselves, we're learning, we're watching, we're observing, we're adapting. And this is where I think many people become unnecessarily hard on themselves, because when they look at their struggles and assume something is wrong with them, they say things like, why am I still anxious? Why do I keep attracting unavailable people? Why can't I relax? Why do I struggle with confidence? Why do I keep people pleasing? And I wish more people understood this. Most of your patterns started as protection. Most of your patterns started as protection. One of the things I find very fascinating about the human mind and body is how intelligent they are. Even the behaviors we dislike often began as solutions. Perhaps people-pleasing helped you avoid conflicts. Perhaps perfectionism helped you gain approval. Perhaps independence protected you from disappointment, or staying busy helped you avoid difficult emotions. Shutting down emotionally helped you survive overwhelming experiences. The problem isn't that these adaptations existed. The problem is that many of them continue long after they're needed. Imagine wearing a winter coat in the middle of summer. The coat isn't bad, it served a purpose, but eventually it becomes too heavy, too restrictive, too uncomfortable. And many emotional patterns work in the same way. They protected us once, but eventually they began limiting us. This is where I think the wellness industry sometimes gets it wrong, because there is often this underlying message that says you need fixing, you need improving, you need to become a better version of yourself. And honestly, I don't believe that. I don't think healing is about becoming someone else. I think healing is about becoming more fully yourself. The person underneath the fear, conditioning, survival strategies or stories. Healing isn't about adding more, it's about removing what was never truly yours to carry. And that's a very different perspective, because when you believe you're broken, you approach healing from shame. But when you understand that you've adapted to survive, you approach healing from compassion. And compassion creates change. Shame rarely does. One of the ways I personally like to work with the chakra system is through questions. Not diagnosis, not labels, questions. Because each chakra is essentially asking something. As we already covered, the root chakra asks, am I safe? The sacral chakra asks, can I feel? The solar plexus asks, who am I? The heart chakra asks, can I love and be loved? The throat chakra asks, can I express my truth? The third eye asks, can I trust myself? The crown asks, can I trust life? And if you sit with those 7 questions for long enough, you'll realize they contain many of the challenges we face throughout our lives. Now, I want to speak from my own experience for a moment, because whilst I can talk about theory and philosophy and psychology all day long, some lessons can only be learned through living. One of the biggest lessons healing has taught me is that awareness comes before change. So many people want transformation immediately. They want the breakthrough, solution, answer, the thing that finally fixes everything. But healing rarely works like that. Most transformation begins with awareness of a pattern, a belief, a feeling, a wound, because we can't change what we refuse to see. And sometimes awareness alone is incredibly powerful, because once you see a pattern clearly, you can no longer pretend it isn't there. And that creates choice. Now let's come back to the body, because if there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it's that healing isn't purely intellectual. You cannot think your way into feeling safe. You cannot analyze your way into self-worth. You cannot logic your way into connection. At some point, the body has to be involved. And this is why I love the work I do, whether it's holistic massage, EFT, breath work, meditation, somatic healing, nervous system regulation, gentle movement. All of these practices invite us back into relationship with ourselves. Not because they're magical, but because they help create awareness, presence, connection. And often that's what we're really missing. We're not disconnected from ourselves because we lack information. We're disconnected because we've become disconnected from feeling. Now, I know some of you are listening and will be thinking, okay, so where do I start? And honestly, start simple. Start by paying attention. Notice what makes you feel safe and what doesn't, what drains your energy and what nourishes your energy, what relationships leaving you feel expanded and which ones leave you feeling contracted. Notice your body, your breath, your emotions, your patterns, because awareness is a practice. You don't have to meditate for 2 hours a day. You don't need to move to a mountain. You don't need to buy hundreds of crystals. You simply need to start to begin to listen. Before we close today's episode, I want to invite you into a brief reflection. So wherever you are right now, if it's safe to do so, just take a slow breath. And another. And another. And ask yourself, where in my life do I feel the most grounded? Where do I feel the most disconnected? Where am I holding on? And where am I being invited to let go? What part of me is asking for attention? Not judgment, not criticism, not fixing, attention. Because often the parts of ourselves that need healing aren't asking to be changed. They're asking to be heard. And perhaps that's what this entire episode has really been about. Not chakras or spirituality or science or philosophy, but listening. Listening to your body, your emotions, your intuition, your needs, your humanity. And as we come to end this conversation, I want to leave you with something I truly believe. You do not need to have perfectly balanced chakras. You do not need to heal every wound. You do not need to become enlightened. You do not need to get everything right. You're allowed to be a work in progress. You're allowed to still be healing. You're allowed to still be learning. And perhaps the goal isn't perfection. Perhaps the goal is simply a deeper relationship with yourself. A relationship built on curiosity rather than criticism, compassion rather than shame, awareness rather than avoidance. Because the more we understand ourselves, the more freedom we create. And the more freedom we create, the more fully we can live. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated, I'd absolutely love to hear your biggest takeaway. Which chakra spoke to you the most? Which question stayed with you? And what are you curious to explore next? Until next time, take good care.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at _the_grateful_living.